He thought his past was gone. Then it crossed the street in front of him. Elliot Carver was heading home along Park Avenue, already halfway into tomorrow's problems, when traffic slowed for a crossing light. That's when he saw her. Sarah Aina, older, steadier, carrying herself like someone who learned to survive without asking. She stepped off the curb with two small boys strapped close, moving carefully through the noise. She didn't look at Elliot. She didn't hesitate. One boy clutched her collar. The other pressed his face into her shoulder. And in that single glance, before memory could catch up, Elliot understood this wasn't coincidence. Most people would have driven past. That choice decides everything. What Elliot does next doesn't explain the past. It exposes who paid for it. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The leather seat of the Maybach molded perfectly to Elliot Carver's frame as he glided down Park Avenue, the city's pulse reduced to a blur of glass and steel outside his tinted windows. His phone pressed against his ear. Fourth call in 20 minutes. Push it through. I'll review later, Elliot said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made board members shift in their seats. The acquisition was minor, a tech startup in Brooklyn worth barely 8 figures, but control was everything. Every detail, every decision. He ended the call without ceremony and stared ahead at the river of taillights bleeding into the twilight. Most people wouldn't notice what happened next. They'd be scrolling, distracted, half present in their own lives. But Elliot had built an empire on noticing, on seeing opportunities others missed, on reading rooms before he entered them. The irony wouldn't hit him until later. His calendar sat open on the center console. Dinner with Claire Whitlock at 8, a charity gala at 9:30, tomorrow's breakfast meeting at 6:15. The machine never stopped. That's what made him different. What separates those who succeed from those who simply survive is whether they stop moving, and Elliot Carver never stopped. Margaret Sloan had once told him he lived like a man running from something. He'd laughed it off. She'd been his estate manager for 12 years before retiring last spring. Good woman. Too sentimental. Another call buzzed through. Julian Marks, his family attorney. Not now, Julian. It's about the Park Slow property. We need. Tomorrow. Elliot disconnected. The Maybach's engine hummed, a low purr of German engineering. Outside, Manhattan performed its evening ritual, joggers, dog walkers, the well-dressed and the desperate all sharing the same 15 blocks of manufactured paradise. Elliot had stopped seeing them as people years ago. They were patterns, data points, background noise to his ascent. Thomas Reed used to drive this route. Good man, Thomas. Retired 6 months ago, moved to Vermont. Said he wanted to remember what quiet sounded like. Elliot had given him a generous severance and forgotten him by the next quarter. Now Elliot drove himself. Preferred it. Control. His phone lit up again, a notification about the Tokyo markets. He glanced down for just a moment. Traffic slowed. The brake lights ahead flared red, sudden and collective. Elliot's foot found the brake pedal instinctively, the Maybach responding with the smooth obedience of a $250,000 machine. He looked up, and his entire world stopped moving. The crosswalk stretched before him like a stage, lit by the amber glow of streetlights and the dying sun caught between buildings. Bodies moved across it in the predictable rhythm of evening pedestrians, briefcases, shopping bags, earbuds, oblivion. Then she appeared. Sarah Aina stepped off the curb with the careful deliberation of someone carrying the world. 2 small boys were strapped to her body in a cream-colored carrier, their brown knit hats creating twin silhouettes against her green and white uniform. One child gripped her collar with tiny fingers. The other pressed his face deep into her shoulder, seeking warmth or comfort or invisibility. She didn't look left, didn't look right. She certainly didn't look at the black Maybach idling 15 feet away. But Elliot saw everything. The way she moved. That same efficient grace he'd noticed years ago when she'd worked in his home. The set of her shoulders, broader now, weighted with something more than physical burden. This is where most people assume coincidence. They'd tell themselves it was a stranger who merely resembled someone from the past. They'd blink, shake their heads, drive on. Elliot's hands locked on the steering wheel. No. The word barely escaped his lips, a whisper swallowed by the leather interior and his own disbelief. Sarah's profile caught the light as she reached the center line. The same strong jaw. The same focused expression she'd worn while folding his shirts, preparing his meals, moving through his penthouse like a ghost he'd paid to be invisible. The twins shifted against her. The one gripping her collar turned his head slightly, just enough for Elliot to see a small face, maybe 2 years old, eyes closed against the city noise. 2 of them. Boys. Identical. Sarah reached the opposite curb and stepped up without breaking stride. She disappeared into the evening crowd flowing toward the subway entrance, absorbed into the masses like water returning to water. The entire crossing had taken maybe 20 seconds. Most people would have told themselves they imagined it. That memory plays tricks. That the mind sees what it wants to see, or what it fears most. Elliot sat frozen, his empire reduced to background static. The phone buzzed in the cup holder. Claire's name flashed on the screen. The gala. Dinner. Tomorrow's meetings. All of it suddenly felt like noise from another life. His foot found the brake pedal again, though the car had already stopped moving. Behind him, a horn bleated, irritated, impatient. The light had turned green. Elliot pulled the Maybach to the right, cutting off a taxi, and jerked the wheel toward the curb. The parking spot was illegal, marked with warnings about towing. He didn't care. Elliot parked the car. His hand trembled as he killed the engine. Through the windshield, he could still see the crosswalk, empty now except for new strangers crossing. None of them her. But the image remained burned into his vision. Sarah Aina, carrying 2 boys who looked exactly alike, walking through his world as if he didn't exist. The interior of the Maybach felt suddenly claustrophobic, the luxury suffocating. Elliot's breath came shallow as fragments assembled themselves in his mind, puzzle pieces he'd never bothered to examine before. Sarah had been temporary. That's what he'd told himself. All household staff were temporary in his world. They came, they served, they left. The penthouse required a rotating efficiency, people who understood their place in the machinery of his life. She'd worked for him for 8 months, maybe 9. He couldn't remember exactly. Margaret Sloan had hired her. Spring of 2022, perhaps? Sarah had been quiet, competent, unremarkable in the way Elliot preferred. She cleaned without disrupting, cooked without conversation, existed in the margins of his awareness. Then she was gone. She left. Elliot heard himself say to the empty car, testing the words he'd carried for years. But even as he spoke them, a different memory surfaced. Thomas Reed's voice, careful and measured, during one of those late drives home. Elliot had mentioned something about staff turnover, complained about Margaret having to train someone new again. Thomas had glanced at him in the rearview mirror. No, sir. She was let go. The correction had been gentle but firm. Elliot had dismissed it, returned to his emails. The distinction hadn't mattered then. Left. Let go. Removed. What difference did semantics make when the result was the same? Now, gripping the steering wheel in a parked car on Park Avenue, the difference felt seismic. Margaret had handled the paperwork. She'd handled everything. Hiring, firing, the business of keeping Elliot's domestic life frictionless. He'd signed off on decisions without reading them, trusted her judgment on matters too small for his attention. Leaving now means believing the version that protects him, that Sarah had resigned for personal reasons, that whatever happened was natural attrition, the normal churn of employment, that those twins had nothing to do with him. His phone buzzed again. Julian Marks. Claire. Someone from Tokyo. Elliot looked at the subway entrance where Sarah had disappeared. Evening commuters poured down the steps like water circling a drain. She could be anywhere in that system by now. Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx. The city swallowed people whole. His hand moved to the door handle. The metal felt cold against his palm, real in a way nothing else had felt in hours. Through the tinted window, he could see his reflection. Elliot Carver, master of every room he entered, frozen in a parked car because of a woman he'd barely remembered until 3 minutes ago. What separates the guilty from the innocent is often just the courage to ask the next question. Elliot stepped out of the car. The sidewalk felt foreign beneath Elliot's Italian leather shoes, as if he'd stepped onto a stage he'd only ever watched from the wings. The subway entrance loomed 30 feet ahead, a dark mouth swallowing the evening rush. He moved toward it, weaving through pedestrians who didn't recognize him, didn't care who he was. Then he saw her again. Sarah had stopped at a street vendor near the subway steps, the twins still strapped to her chest. She was purchasing something, bottled water, maybe, or a snack. The transaction was brief, efficient. The vendor handed her change. She tucked it into her pocket, with one hand while the other steadied the boys. Elliot slowed his approach, positioning himself behind a newsstand, close enough to observe, far enough to remain invisible. The twins were awake now, both of them. They couldn't be older than 2, maybe younger. Their small hands explored Sarah's uniform collar, her hair, each other's hats. This is where most people would look away, would convince themselves that resemblance means nothing, that thousands of children look alike. But Elliot had built billions on pattern recognition. The boy on the left turned his head, scanning the street with curious eyes. Even from 15 feet away, Elliot could see it, the slight asymmetry of the child's left ear, the way it folded at the top. Not a defect, a family trait. Elliot's own ear bore the same mark. His father's had too. A genetic signature the Carver men carried like an invisible seal. His breath caught. The mathematics assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Sarah had left, been let go, in early 2023, nearly 3 years ago. These children looked approximately 2 years old. The timeline aligned with the precision of a balance sheet, numbers that didn't lie even when people did. Sarah adjusted the carrier and began moving toward the subway stairs. Elliot stepped out from behind the newsstand, his voice escaping before calculation could stop it. "How old are they?" Sarah froze mid-step, her shoulders tense beneath the twins' weight. For 3 seconds, she didn't move. Then, without turning, her voice cut through the street noise, calm, cold, final. "Old enough." She descended the first step. This is where people stop listening, because the answer scares them. They retreat into doubt, into questions about proof and certainty. Anything to avoid the truth standing directly in front of them. But Elliot couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Sarah took another step down, the twins bobbing gently with her movement. The boy on the right had fallen back asleep, his face pressed into her shoulder. But the one on the left, the one with the ear, remained alert. As Sarah descended the third step, the child's gaze swept across the crowd and locked onto Elliot. One twin looked at Elliot for the first time. The boy's eyes were gray-blue, the exact shade Elliot saw in his own mirror every morning. Not brown like Sarah's, not dark like the evening sky above them. Gray-blue like winter water, like the Atlantic in February, like every Carver who'd ever lived. The child stared at him with unsettling focus, as if recognizing something he couldn't name. His tiny hand released Sarah's collar and extended outward, not reaching, just acknowledging. A gesture too deliberate for coincidence. Elliot's heart hammered against his ribs. Sarah noticed the child's attention and followed his gaze. For the first time since the crosswalk, her eyes met Elliot's. There was no surprise in her expression, no shock, just a deep, exhausted knowledge, as if she'd always known this moment would arrive eventually. She didn't speak, didn't accuse, didn't explain. She simply turned and continued down the stairs, disappearing into the fluorescent depths of the subway system with the 2 children who had Elliot Carver's eyes, his ear, his genetic legacy strapped to her chest. The street vendor called out to another customer. A taxi horn blared. The city continued its indifferent rotation, and Elliot stood paralyzed, watching the space where they'd vanished, knowing that some truths don't need words to destroy you. Elliot's legs moved before his mind could authorize the decision. He plunged down the subway steps, dodging commuters, his expensive suit suddenly ridiculous in the harsh underground lighting. The smell hit him, urine, metal, humanity compressed, since he'd forgotten existed since Thomas had stopped driving him everywhere. Sarah stood at the turnstile, swiping her Metro card. The twins shifted against her as she pushed through. "Wait." Elliot's voice echoed off the tiled walls. She paused on the other side of the turnstile, but didn't turn around. He fumbled for his wallet, realized he didn't have a MetroCard, hadn't ridden the subway in perhaps a decade. A businessman beside him swiped through. Elliot caught the turnstile before it locked, slipped through behind him. Illegal. He didn't care. Sarah. He was 10 feet behind her now, close enough to see the tension in her spine. Please. She stopped walking. The platform stretched ahead, relatively empty between trains. She turned slowly, her hands cradling the twins protectively. Up close, Elliot could see the changes time had carved into her. New lines around her eyes, a hardness in her jaw that hadn't existed before, but also something else, a strength, a gravity he didn't remember. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Why didn't you come back? The question escaped him, raw and unpolished. Sarah's laugh was quiet, almost sad. Come back. She adjusted the carrier, though the twins didn't need adjusting. To what, Mr. Carver? To the penthouse where I was dismissed without explanation? To the estate manager who handed me a check and told me my services were no longer required? I didn't know. You never asked. Her voice remained level, but each word landed like a judgment. You didn't know because knowing would have required you to see me as a person instead of a function. If you leave here, you'll believe this was a misunderstanding, that Sarah had hidden the truth maliciously, that she'd made choices designed to hurt him. The narrative would be easy to construct. He was the victim of deception. She was the opportunist who disappeared. But her eyes told a different story. I didn't know I was pregnant when Margaret let me go, Sarah continued. I found out 3 weeks later. Twins, due in November. She paused, her gaze dropping to the children against her chest. I thought about calling. Thought about showing up at your building. Thought about a lot of things. Why didn't you? Her eyes met his again, and in them he saw something that cut deeper than anger, pity. I didn't want them growing up waiting. The words hung in the stale subway air. Waiting for what? Elliot's voice cracked slightly. For you to notice them. To make time for them between board meetings and acquisitions. To show up on Christmas morning because your assistant blocked it out on your calendar. She shifted her weight, and one of the twins stirred, making a small sound. I watched you for 8 months, Mr. Carver. I saw how you lived. What kind of mother would I be if I let my children become another appointment you'd eventually cancel? A train approached in the distance, its rumble growing in the tunnel. Elliot's hand moved toward his phone. Instinct, the urge to call Julian, to fix this with lawyers and money and the machinery he understood. But halfway to his pocket, he stopped himself. Elliot reached for his phone, stopped himself. Because even he could see that whatever was happening here couldn't be solved with a wire transfer. The children sleeping against Sarah's chest weren't a problem to be managed. They were human beings. His human beings, possibly. The twins, Ari and Luca, though he didn't know their names yet. His sons. The train pulled into the station, brakes screaming. The subway doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Commuters flooded out. A tide of exhausted humanity flowing around Sarah and Elliot like water around stones. She didn't move toward the train. Neither did he. When the platform cleared, Elliot's voice came out hoarse. Did anyone know? Sarah's expression shifted. Not quite surprise. More like recognition that he was finally asking the right questions. Margaret knew, she said simply. Or suspected. She called me into her office the day she let me go. Told me the household was restructuring. Asked if I had any health concerns she should know about for the exit paperwork. Elliot's stomach turned. You told her. I didn't know yet. Sarah's hand moved absently to one of the twins' backs, a protective gesture. But she knew I'd been sick in the mornings. Knew I'd asked to adjust my schedule. Margaret Sloan didn't miss details, Mr. Carver. She built her career on knowing everything before you did. The platform lights flickered. Another train approached in the opposite tunnel. When I found out 3 weeks later, I did call. Sarah's voice remained steady, factual. Left a message with the building's front desk. Then another one. Then I tried Margaret directly. And she told me the matter had been handled through proper legal channels. That any future contact should go through Mr. Marks, your family attorney. That I'd sign documents upon termination that included confidentiality clauses. Sarah's jaw tightened. I was 26 years old, Mr. Carver, pregnant with twins, working 2 jobs to cover rent. I didn't have money for lawyers to tell me what I'd signed. Elliot felt the ground shifting beneath him. Julian Marks had been his attorney for 15 years, handled everything from corporate contracts to estate planning. The idea that Julian had known, had actively blocked communication. Julian never told me. He did his job. Sarah's tone held no bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Protected the client, managed the liability, made sure the problem went away quietly. Walking away now means never hearing who benefited from the silence. It meant returning to the version of events where Elliot was simply ignorant, where responsibility could be diffused across subordinates and systems, where the machinery of his life had functioned exactly as designed. But the machinery had destroyed something. Someone. Multiple someones. Elliot's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Thomas, Elliot said suddenly, the name arriving with the weight of realization. Thomas drove me past your apartment building. Brooklyn, wasn't it? Crown Heights. Sarah nodded slowly. He knew which building. He always knew where the staff lived, said it was part of being thorough. Elliot's voice rose slightly. He suspected. He had to have suspected. As if summoned by the accusation, Elliot's mind supplied the memory. Thomas's careful silence after Sarah left. The way he'd stopped mentioning her name. The route changes that took them away from certain neighborhoods. Small adjustments that seemed like nothing at the time. Elliot pulled out his phone, scrolled to Thomas's contact. His finger hovered over the call button. Don't. Sarah's voice cut through his spiral. You won't like what he tells you. But Elliot was already dialing. The phone rang twice before Thomas's familiar baritone answered. Mr. Carver? Everything all right? Sarah Ana, Elliot said without preamble. Did you know? The pause lasted 3 seconds too long. Know what, sir? Thomas. Elliot's voice dropped to something dangerous. Did you? No. Another pause. Then quiet and resigned. Enough people to make sure you didn't. The confession landed like a physical blow. Who else? Elliot demanded. Sir, with respect, you built a system designed to keep you isolated from complications. Margaret, Julie, and myself, we were all doing exactly what you hired us to do. Protect your time. Manage your exposure. Keep the machinery running smoothly, so you never had to think about the oil that made it turn. Elliot's hand shook. She was pregnant with my children. Which is precisely why we made sure you never knew. Thomas's voice remained calm, professional. You would have made decisions based on obligation rather than choice. Would have resented them eventually. We protected you from yourself, sir. That was always the job. The call ended. Sarah watched Elliot's face as the truth settled into his bones. She didn't look triumphant, just tired. She adjusted the twins in their carrier, checking straps and buckles with practiced efficiency. One of them, the boy with Elliot's ear, stirred and made a soft sound. Sarah murmured something Elliot couldn't hear, and the child settled. Sarah adjusted the twins and prepared to leave. Wait, Elliot said, desperation creeping into his voice. Just wait. Sarah turned back, but her body language screamed departure. The next train would arrive in minutes. Elliot could see it in her eyes. She'd already stayed longer than she'd planned. I can fix this, Elliot said, the words tumbling out with the force of someone used to solving problems with resources. Money, a better apartment, childcare, education funds, healthcare, whatever you need, whatever they need. It was the wrong thing to say. He knew at the moment Sarah's expression shifted. You can't fix what already survived without you. The words were quiet, but absolute, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd already fought wars Elliot couldn't imagine. She shifted her weight, and both twins moved with her, synchronized to her rhythm in a way that spoke of years of shared survival. They're my children, Elliot said, and even to his own ears it sounded hollow, a claim to ownership rather than relationship. They're my sons, Sarah corrected. Ari and Luca. They have names, Mr. Carver. They have favorite foods and bedtime routines, and one of them is terrified of loud noises, while the other laughs at everything. They have lives that don't include you because I built those lives from nothing while you were acquiring companies and attending galas. Elliot flinched. I didn't know. You didn't ask. Sarah's voice finally carried an edge. For 3 years, you never once wondered what happened to the woman who worked in your home for 8 months. Never thought to check if there were consequences, too. She stopped, shook her head. You didn't ask because asking would have required seeing me. Actually seeing me. Most people won't stay long enough to hear what she chooses next. They'd retreat into anger or defensiveness, would protect themselves from the discomfort of witnessing their own blindness reflected back. But Elliot forced himself to stay present, to not reach for his phone or his wallet or any of the tools that usually insulated him from difficult truths. What do you want? He asked finally. Sarah studied him for a long moment. The twins shifted again, and she placed both hands protectively over them. When she spoke, her voice was measured, deliberate. I want you to understand that whatever happens next, it happens on my terms. She paused. Ari and Luca have a life, a routine, a home. I won't let you disrupt that because you suddenly discovered guilt or paternal instinct or whatever it is you're feeling right now. They deserve to know their father. They deserve stability. Sarah's eyes hardened. They deserve a parent who shows up consistently, not when it's convenient, who loves them for who they are, not what they represent, who sees them as children, not as consequences to be managed. Elliot opened his mouth to argue, but Sarah raised a hand. If you want to be in their lives, truly in their lives, then you do it right. No lawyers, no PR teams, no checks designed to make this go away. You show up. You learn their names, their personalities, their needs. You prove you're capable of putting someone else first for the first time in your life. The platform rumbled with an approaching train. And if I can't? Elliot asked, the question escaping before pride could stop it. Then you walk away now and let us keep surviving without you. Because half present is worse than absent. These boys don't need a father who treats them like a quarterly obligation. The train pulled into the station, brakes screaming. Sarah named her terms. Every other Saturday. 2 hours. At the park near my apartment in Crown Heights. You show up alone. No driver. No assistant. No bodyguards. Just you. She met his eyes. You get to know them slowly. Earn their trust. Prove you're more than a checkbook. And if they ask who I am, I'll tell them the truth. Sarah's voice softened slightly. That you're someone who wants to know them. Whether you become their father depends entirely on what you do next. The subway doors opened. Passengers flooded the platform. Sarah stepped toward the train, then stopped. This Saturday, 2 p.m., Brower Park. Don't be late, Mr. Carver. Children remember when adults let them down. She boarded the train. The doors closed. Through the window, Elliot watched her settle into a seat, the twins still strapped to her chest. Ari, or was it Luca, had woken up and was looking around with curious eyes. The train pulled away, carrying his sons into the dark tunnel. Elliot stood alone on the platform, knowing that every decision he'd made to build his empire had led him to this moment, standing in a subway station, watching the only thing that might actually matter disappear into the darkness. Elliot stood on the empty platform for 7 minutes after the train disappeared. Commuters flowed around him like a river around stone, annoyed at the obstacle, too busy to wonder why a man in a $3,000 suit was frozen in the middle of a subway station. His phone had buzzed 17 times. Claire, Julian, someone from the Tokyo office. The gala had started without him. Deals were waiting. The machine of his life was grinding forward, indifferent to his absence. For the first time in his adult life, Elliot didn't care. He climbed the stairs slowly, emerging onto Park Avenue, where the Maybach still sat illegally parked, a parking ticket tucked under the wiper blade. The city had continued its rotation. The world hadn't stopped because Elliot Carver's life had fractured. Some truths don't come back to punish you. They come back to see if you're finally ready. The question was whether he was. Saturday, 2 p.m., Brower Park. Elliot pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. Saturday was blocked. A brunch meeting with potential investors, followed by a flight to Boston for a conference. The kind of commitments that, until 30 minutes ago, would have been non-negotiable. His finger hovered over the delete button. What did being ready actually mean? Showing up was the minimum, the absolute floor of human decency. Sarah hadn't asked him to be a hero. She'd asked him to be consistent, to prove that two small boys he'd just discovered existed could trust him to prioritize them over spreadsheets and acquisitions. The weight of that request settled into his chest like a stone. He couldn't fix what had already survived without him. Couldn't rewrite 3 years of absence. Couldn't erase the system he'd built that made sure he never had to see the consequences of his own choices. Margaret, Thomas, Julian. They'd all been extensions of his will, performing exactly the function he'd hired them for, protecting him from his own humanity. Elliot deleted Saturday's appointments. Then he scrolled further, looking at the pattern of his life rendered in color-coded blocks. Meetings, calls, dinners that were actually negotiations, a calendar that looked like a military campaign, every hour weaponized for profit or influence. Where would 2 children fit in this architecture? Where was the space for playground visits and scraped knees and the slow, unglamorous work of learning to be a father? His phone rang. Claire's face filled the screen. Beautiful, polished, perfectly suited to his world. He let go to voicemail. A text followed immediately. Where are you? People are asking. Elliot stared at the message. People were always asking, always watching. His life had become a performance. Every moment curated for an audience of investors, competitors, and whoever else measured worth in proximity to power. But Ari and Luca didn't know any of that. Didn't care about his net worth or his portfolio or the empire he'd built from his father's shadow. They were 2 years old. They cared about whether someone showed up, whether someone saw them, whether they mattered more than the next deal. Another text from Claire. Julian says you're not answering. Is everything okay? Elliot typed slowly. Something came up. I need to cancel tonight. The response came fast. Cancel? Elliot, this is the Whitmore Foundation Gala. You're being honored. He typed 4 words. Give them my regrets. Then he blocked out every Saturday for the next 6 months. The Maybach's engine purred to life. Elliot pulled away from the curb, leaving the parking ticket behind. As he drove, he passed the crosswalk where he'd first seen Sarah, the spot where his carefully constructed ignorance had finally shattered. The memory of those gray-blue eyes staring at him from a 2-year-old's face refused to fade. He drove to Crown Heights, the GPS guiding him to streets he'd never traveled despite living in New York for 2 decades. The buildings grew shorter, the crowds more diverse, the storefronts less polished. This was the city beyond his bubble, the one that existed outside penthouse windows and private cars. Brower Park appeared on his right, modest, functional, populated by families who couldn't afford private playgrounds and nannies. Elliot parked across the street and studied it. A basketball court, playground equipment, benches where parents watched children who actually knew their names, their fears, their favorite colors. This was where he'd meet his sons. Not in a conference room or a lawyer's office. Not with contracts or DNA tests or any of the machinery he'd used to navigate every other relationship in his life. Just presence. If allowed. Elliot's phone buzzed again. Julian this time. He answered. Where the hell are you? Julian's voice carried an edge of panic. Claire is calling me. The foundation is calling me. And you're just gone? I need to ask you something, Elliot said, his voice flat. Sarah Aina. 3 years ago. Did she try to contact me? The silence on the other end lasted too long. Julian. She did. The admission came out reluctant. Multiple times. I advised her that any communication should go through proper legal channels and that she'd signed documents precluding. You knew she was pregnant. I suspected. Julian's tone shifted to defensive. She never explicitly stated it. But the timing, the nature of her inquiries. And you never told me. I protected you. Julian's voice hardened. That's what you pay me for, Elliot. To shield you from complications that could derail your focus. You were in the middle of the Techmark acquisition. You were. I was a father. The words came out raw. I am a father. To two boys I didn't know existed because you decided I didn't need to know. You're angry now, but in 6 months you'll thank me for. Elliot ended the call. He sat in the parked car, watching parents push children on swings, watching fathers lift daughters onto monkey bars, watching the ordinary miracle of people showing up for people who needed them. Consistency, not promises. That's what Sarah had asked for. Not grand gestures or financial settlements or public acknowledgement. Just the radical act of appearing, repeatedly, until two small boys learned they could trust him. Elliot didn't know if he was capable of it. Didn't know if a man who'd spent 20 years optimizing every hour for maximum productivity could learn to waste an afternoon watching toddlers play. Didn't know if he deserved the chance. But Saturday at 2 p.m., he'd find out. He pulled away from Brower Park as the sun set over Brooklyn, knowing that some things can't be fixed, only faced, and that showing up is both the smallest thing he could do and the hardest thing he'd ever attempted. You can't delegate your way out of being human. Elliot built a life where other people handled his complications, but when those complications were his own children, all the money and power in the world couldn't replace simply showing up. Consistency matters more than compensation. Sarah didn't need his wealth. She needed proof that he could prioritize two small boys over his empire. True accountability isn't about fixing the past. It's about being present for the future, even when you don't deserve the chance. Some truths return not to punish you, but to see if you're finally ready to become the person you should have been all along.